The air in the basement of the British Museum smelled like centuries. That peculiar combination of ancient dust, preserved wood, and the faint metallic tang of artifacts that had survived longer than empires, longer than languages, longer than the collective memory of everyone who had ever touched them before being catalogued and filed away in the endless labyrinth of storage rooms that existed beneath one of the world's most prestigious institutions. It was April of 1923, and Dr. Eleanor Hartwick, a 32-year-old assistant curator who had spent the better part of her academic life studying Mesopotamian texts with the kind of obsessive devotion that concerned her family and fascinated her colleagues, sat hunched over a workbench with a cracked clay tablet in front of her that would, if she was reading it correctly, fundamentally challenge everything she thought she knew about human history, human achievement, and humanity's place in the vast and indifferent timeline of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before anyone thought to write anything down at all. The tablet itself was unremarkable in appearance, roughly the size of a modern paperback novel, its surface covered in the distinctive wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script that the Sumerians had pressed into wet clay nearly 5,000 years earlier. And it had been sitting in a crate of similar artifacts that had been excavated from the ruins of Nippur decades before, catalogued with a reference number that meant nothing to anyone except the filing system, and essentially forgotten, in the way that thousands of ancient objects are forgotten in museums around the world, waiting patiently in their climate-controlled darkness for someone to finally pay attention to what they've been trying to say, across the enormous gulf of time that separates their creation from our casual indifference. Eleanor had been working her way through this particular collection for months, translating inventory, lists and religious hymns, and the mundane administrative records of a long-dead bureaucracy. When she encountered this tablet and felt something shift in her understanding, the way you might feel the ground tilt beneath your feet when you suddenly realize you've been standing on the edge of something vast and previously unimaginable. What stopped her cold? What made her set down her pencil and lean back in her chair and stare at the ancient text with a mixture of scholarly excitement and something closer to existential dread? Was not the usual content of Sumerian tablets, not the records of grain distributions or the hymns to Inanna or the legal codes that governed property disputes, but rather a list, simple and stark, and presented with the matter-of-fact directness that the Sumerians brought to all their record-keeping. A list that enumerated something that should not have been possible for them to enumerate, something that shattered the comfortable narrative of progressive human development that every modern person carries around in their head like an unexamined assumption. The tablet described 6 ages of the world, 6 complete cycles of civilization that had existed before the Sumerian culture itself, each one lasting for periods that ranged from 10,000 to 40,000 years, each one characterized by different technological achievements and different forms of knowledge, and each one ending in catastrophe so complete that almost nothing remained except the faintest echoes in mythology, the distant memory of lost peoples who had built their own versions of greatness and watched it all crumble into dust and silence. Eleanor read the passage 3 times, checking her translation against every lexicon she had, convinced that she must be misunderstanding something fundamental about the grammar or the context, because what she was reading suggested that the Sumerians, these people who invented writing, who built the first cities, who developed mathematics and astronomy and law codes that would influence civilization for millennia, did not consider themselves to be the beginning of anything at all, but rather understood themselves to be merely the latest iteration in a sequence, the seventh attempt at building something permanent in a world that seemed determined to erase everything humans created, no matter how magnificent or how certain they were of their own permanence. It was like discovering your birth certificate and finding out that you're actually the seventh child in a family where the first 6 siblings all died under mysterious circumstances that nobody wants to discuss. And suddenly, everything about your existence takes on a different and more precarious meaning. Because if 6 came before and 6 failed, what makes you think you're going to be any different? The modern mind, trained by centuries of Enlightenment thinking and progress narratives, and the deeply embedded assumption that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, rebels against this kind of information with almost physical force. Because we have built our entire self-conception around the idea that history is a line moving upward, a steady climb from caves to cities to smartphones, from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened. And the suggestion that this might not be true, that we might instead be moving in cycles, that other peoples might have reached heights comparable to or exceeding our own, before being swept away by forces they couldn't control, strikes at something fundamental in our need to believe that we matter, that our achievements are permanent, that our civilization will be the one that finally breaks the pattern and lasts forever. Every person alive today walks around with the unconscious certainty that they live in the most advanced society that has ever existed on Earth, that the accumulated knowledge and technology of our current moment represents the absolute peak of what humanity has achieved across the entirety of our species' history. And this assumption is so deep and so unquestioned that we rarely even notice we're making it. The way fish probably don't notice water until someone pulls them out of it, and they suddenly realize there was an entire environment they'd been taking for granted. But the Sumerians, according to this tablet and others like it that Eleanor would discover in the following months of increasingly frantic research, would have found our certainty amusing at best and dangerously naive at worst, because they knew something that we have apparently forgotten in our rush to celebrate our own cleverness, which is that civilizations are fragile things, temporary constructions built on foundations that can crack and crumble with shocking speed when the right pressures are applied, and that the universe is extraordinarily good at applying those pressures at regular intervals, whether through cosmic impacts or climatic catastrophes or the simple accumulated weight of human hubris collapsing under its own contradictions. They kept records of what came before, not because they were particularly interested in mythology or creation stories, but because they believed it was history, actual, documented fact that needed to be preserved and remembered. And they wrote it down with the same straightforward clarity they brought to recording taxes and property boundaries and the phases of the moon, because to them it was all equally real and equally important to understand if you wanted to have any hope of learning from the mistakes of those who came before. The first civilization, according to the tablet Eleanor was translating, had lasted for more than 40,000 years and had focused their technological development on working with stone and understanding principles of resonance and vibration that allowed them to accomplish feats of construction that would seem impossible to later peoples. And Eleanor couldn't help but think about places like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, where precisely carved megalithic structures had been buried deliberately 11,000 years ago by people we're supposed to believe were primitive hunter-gatherers who should barely have been capable of organizing a community potluck, let alone coordinating the labor and engineering knowledge required to move multi-ton stones and carve them with astronomical precision. The second civilization had apparently mastered something to do with harmonics and sound, developing technologies based on acoustic principles that could manipulate matter in ways that seemed more like magic than engineering to those who came after. And Eleanor found herself thinking about the perfect acoustics in ancient temples, the way certain frequencies could make objects levitate in laboratory conditions, the strange reports throughout history of sound being used for purposes that modern science dismissed as impossible or fraudulent because they didn't fit the approved model of how the world was supposed to work. The third civilization was the one that made Eleanor's hands shake slightly as she translated, because it was described as a great maritime culture that had dominated the seas and built cities on coastlines that no longer existed, destroyed by a massive flood that had reshaped the geography of the entire world. And the date the Sumerians gave for this catastrophe aligned almost perfectly with the end of the last ice age, with the period of rapid sea level rise that geological records confirmed had actually happened, swallowing coastlines and drowning entire landscapes under hundreds of feet of water, in what would have seemed like an apocalypse to anyone living through it. This was the civilization that might have been the source for all those flood myths that appear in virtually every ancient culture. The distant memory of Atlantis that Plato wrote about as historical fact, before later peoples decided it must have been allegory or fiction, because surely something that dramatic would have left more evidence. Except that evidence is remarkably hard to find when it's buried under 300 feet of ocean and covered by 11,000 years of sediment. The fourth civilization had been obsessed with astronomy, building monuments aligned to stellar positions that wouldn't repeat for 26,000 years, suggesting either that they had access to knowledge about celestial mechanics that should have taken millennia to accumulate, or that they had inherited that knowledge from somewhere even older. And Eleanor thought about all the ancient structures around the world that tracked solstices and equinoxes and specific star risings with precision that modern architects would struggle to match without computers and laser levels. The fifth civilization had apparently achieved something remarkable with metallurgy and possibly even electricity, developing technologies that left behind artifacts that archaeologists kept finding and then quietly filing away because they appeared in geological strata where they absolutely should not exist. Metal objects showing signs of precision machining in coal deposits hundreds of millions of years old. Metallic spheres in pre-Cambrian rock. Things that violated the approved timeline so thoroughly that it was easier to ignore them than to confront what their existence might mean about our understanding of history. And then there was the sixth civilization, the one the Sumerians actually remembered with some degree of detail, the immediate predecessors who had been destroyed by another massive flood event, with survivors who had travelled to various parts of the world and taught the people they encountered everything they knew about agriculture and mathematics and writing and astronomy, which would explain the puzzle that had bothered historians for decades about why Sumerian civilization seemed to appear suddenly, fully formed, with no primitive developmental period, as if someone had simply downloaded a complete cultural package into the collective mind of a people who should have spent centuries figuring out the basics of urban living. The survivors had been desperate to preserve knowledge, to pass on what they could before it was lost entirely, and the Sumerians had honored that desperation by writing it all down, by creating a record that would last, by trying to warn whoever came after them that this pattern existed, that civilization was not a permanent state, but a temporary achievement that required constant vigilance and humility to maintain. Eleanor sat in that basement, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of human ambition and failure, holding in her hands a message from 5,000 years ago that was, itself, recording messages from much further back. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost crushing, that everything she had been taught about human progress, about the linear march of civilization from primitive to advanced, might be fundamentally wrong. That we might instead be living in the 7th iteration of a cycle that had already destroyed 6 previous attempts at building something permanent, and that our certainty about our own sophistication and permanence might be exactly the kind of arrogance that had doomed all the others before us. The question that haunted her as she carefully set the tablet down and reached for her notebook to begin documenting what she had found was not whether the Sumerians were telling the truth about these previous civilizations, because the more she looked, the more evidence she found that supported rather than contradicted their claims, but rather why we had been so determined to forget, why modern scholarship had been so invested in dismissing these accounts as mythology rather than history, and what it meant for our own future that we were repeating the same patterns while congratulating ourselves on being uniquely advanced. The uncomfortable truth settling over her like a weight was that if the Sumerians were right, if 6 civilizations had indeed risen and fallen before theirs, each one thinking it would last forever, each one destroyed by catastrophes they either couldn't predict or couldn't prevent, then we were not the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely the latest players in a very old game that nobody had won yet. And the odds of us being the exception, of us being the ones who finally broke the cycle, seemed far less certain than anyone wanted to admit, especially when you considered that we had built our entire civilization on technologies and systems that were simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than anything that had come before, dependent on electrical grids and supply chains and specialized knowledge that could vanish in a generation if anything went seriously wrong, leaving future archaeologists to puzzle over our ruins and wonder what kind of people we had been and why we hadn't learned from the warnings that earlier civilizations had tried so hard to preserve. The real question, the one that would consume Eleanor for the rest of her career, and that echoes down to us today across another century of archaeological discoveries and willful ignorance, was not whether these previous civilizations existed, because the evidence keeps accumulating, no matter how much we try to explain it away, but rather what, exactly, they knew that we have forgotten, and whether that forgotten knowledge might be the key to finally breaking the cycle before we become just another set of mysterious ruins for the 8th civilization to puzzle over in another 10,000 years. Assuming anyone survives, to do the puzzling at all. The deeper Eleanor Hartwick delved into the Sumerian archives over the following months and years, cross-referencing texts from Nippur with tablets recovered from Ur and Uruk, and eventually expanding her research to include Babylonian and Akkadian sources that had preserved and elaborated upon these ancient traditions. The more she came to understand that these accounts were not vague creation myths filled with symbolic language and poetic metaphor, but rather something that resembled historical documentation, complete with specific characteristics attributed to each previous age, detailed descriptions of their technological focuses and cultural achievements, and matter-of-fact records of the catastrophes that had ended them, all presented with the same straightforward clarity that the Mesopotamians brought to documenting grain storage quantities and astronomical observations. What emerged from this research was not the comfortable mythology of gradual human progress from primitive to civilized, but rather a disturbing pattern of civilizations rising to remarkable heights through different technological pathways, achieving forms of sophistication that might have equaled or exceeded our own in certain domains, and then being obliterated so completely that subsequent cultures could only preserve fragments of their knowledge, distorted memories that later peoples would interpret as legends about gods and heroes, rather than accounts of actual human societies that had mastered their environments in ways we can barely comprehend today. The first civilization, which the Sumerians referred to with a term that Eleanor translated as something like the builders of harmony, or possibly those who understood the stone's song, was described as having lasted for more than 40,000 years, a time span so vast that it challenges our modern conception of what a civilization even is, given that our entire recorded history, from the first Sumerian cities to today, encompasses only about 5,000 years. And this ancient culture had supposedly maintained continuity and sophisticated knowledge for 8 times that duration. According to the texts, these people had developed their entire technological system around understanding the properties of stone, not simply as building material to be cut and stacked, but as a substance that could be manipulated through principles of resonance and vibration, allowing them to accomplish feats of construction that would seem utterly impossible to later peoples who had lost the knowledge of how such things were done. And Eleanor could not help but think about the megalithic structures scattered across the world that continue to baffle modern engineers. Places like Göbekli Tepe, with its massive T-shaped pillars decorated with sophisticated carvings that supposedly predated agriculture and civilization itself. Or Pumapunku in Bolivia, with its precisely cut stone blocks that show evidence of machine-like precision in their angles and measurements. Or the massive stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, where individual blocks weighing over 800 tons were somehow quarried, transported, and lifted into place using techniques that our modern construction equipment would struggle to replicate, even with cranes and hydraulics and computer-aided engineering. The texts suggested that this first civilization had understood something about acoustic properties and harmonic frequencies that allowed them to reduce the apparent weight of massive stones, or perhaps to cut them with a precision that made them fit together without mortar, in configurations so exact that you cannot slide a piece of paper between the joints, even today, thousands of years after their construction, And while modern archaeologists insist that these structures must have been built using only copper tools and wooden rollers and enormous amounts of human labor organized through religious devotion, Eleanor found herself wondering why we were so certain that our assumptions about ancient technological limitations were correct, especially when the physical evidence kept presenting us with accomplishments that should not have been possible using the tools we imagine they had. As if we were trying to explain how someone built a computer using only an abacus and refusing to consider that perhaps they had access to tools and knowledge we haven't accounted for in our models of how ancient peoples were supposed to operate. The first civilization apparently fell to some kind of geological catastrophe, possibly a massive earthquake or volcanic event that shattered their stone monuments and scattered their people, leaving behind only the most durable remnants of their architectural achievements. Structures so massive and so precisely constructed that even catastrophe could not completely erase them. Though time and erosion and the ignorant reuse of materials by later cultures have degraded much of what once stood as testament to their sophistication. The second civilization, which Eleanor found referenced in multiple tablets with descriptions that aligned remarkably well across different sources, had apparently taken a completely different technological path, focusing their developments on understanding sound, vibration, and what the texts called something that might translate as the architecture of air or the shaping of invisible forces, suggesting a culture that had mastered principles of acoustics and harmonics to a degree that allowed them to accomplish things that would seem more like magic than engineering to anyone who didn't understand the underlying physics. The records described structures built to amplify and direct specific frequencies, healing practices based on sound that could affect human tissue at cellular levels, and methods of moving objects or even affecting consciousness through carefully calibrated acoustic phenomena. And while this might sound like pure fantasy to the modern ear, trained to dismiss anything that smacks of the mystical or unexplainable, Eleanor kept encountering evidence that at least some of these claims might have a basis in actual technological achievement rather than wishful mythology. Ancient temples around the world demonstrate acoustic properties that seem far too sophisticated to be accidental, with chambers that amplify certain frequencies while dampening others, creating effects that modern sound engineers find remarkable when they bother to study them. And recent experiments have demonstrated that objects can indeed be levitated using focused sound waves, that certain frequencies can affect human mood and physiology in measurable ways, and that acoustic phenomena can produce effects that seem impossible until you understand the physics underlying them. The second civilization apparently ended not through geological catastrophe, but through what the texts described as a great darkening, possibly a volcanic winter or cosmic impact that blocked out the sun and disrupted the climate patterns they had grown dependent upon, causing their agricultural systems to collapse and their population to crash, leaving survivors who carried forward fragments of their acoustic knowledge in the form of chants and rhythms and architectural principles that later cultures would preserve without understanding their original purpose or sophistication. The way we might preserve the form of a ritual without remembering why it was important or what it originally accomplished. Eleanor found it grimly ironic that we consider ourselves so advanced, while dismissing the possibility that sound-based technologies might have been developed to high levels of sophistication by ancient peoples, even though we ourselves use ultrasound for medical imaging and sonar for navigation, and acoustic weapons for crowd control. As if these applications of sound technology only became possible once we had the theoretical framework to understand them in modern scientific terms. When the actual physics of sound waves and their effects on matter have been consistent throughout human history, and could have been discovered and exploited by any culture that paid sufficient attention to acoustic phenomena and had the patience to experiment and develop applications across many generations. The third civilization was the one that captured public imagination whenever fragments of these accounts leaked into popular culture, because this was almost certainly the source of the Atlantis legend that Plato had recorded in his dialogues, claiming he had received the account from Egyptian priests who had preserved the memory of a great maritime civilization that had dominated the seas and built magnificent cities on lands that no longer existed, destroyed by a catastrophic flood that reshaped the geography of the known world. The Sumerian texts described this culture with specific details about their mastery of navigation, their understanding of ocean currents and weather patterns, their development of port cities and trading networks that connected distant lands, and their eventual destruction by a deluge so massive that it became the foundation for flood myths in virtually every ancient culture, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of Noah to similar accounts in Greek, Hindu, Chinese, and indigenous American traditions, suggesting a real event so traumatic that it seared itself into human cultural memory across vast geographic distances. The dating the Sumerians provided for this catastrophe aligned remarkably well with the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,600 years ago, when geological records confirm that sea levels rose dramatically as massive ice sheets melted, in some regions increasing by as much as 400 feet over relatively short periods, transforming the global coastline and drowning vast areas of low-lying land where, logically, most people would have been living. Because then, as now, coastal regions offered the richest resources, the best transportation networks, and the most favorable conditions for developing complex societies. Eleanor found it telling that mainstream archaeology dismissed the Atlantis story as pure fiction, despite the overwhelming consistency of flood accounts across unconnected ancient cultures, and despite the geological evidence confirming that a catastrophic rise in sea levels had indeed occurred during the timeframe ancient sources suggested. As if we preferred the comfort of believing that ancient peoples simply made up elaborate and remarkably similar stories about world-destroying floods, rather than confronting the possibility that they were describing actual historical events that had wiped out previous civilizations, leaving only scattered survivors to pass down traumatic memories that would be preserved in mythological form by their descendants. The third civilization had apparently achieved sophisticated understanding of maritime technology, possibly including forms of navigation that would not be rediscovered until much later in human history. And their destruction by flood would explain why we keep finding mysterious structures on continental shelves and underwater formations that look suspiciously artificial when examined by marine archaeologists, though these discoveries tend to be quietly filed away or explained as natural formations, because admitting they might be remnants of pre-flood civilizations would require rewriting too many established narratives about when and how human technological development occurred. The fourth civilization, according to the texts Eleanor was piecing together from multiple fragmentary sources, had become obsessed with astronomy to a degree that seems almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective, building monuments and structures aligned to celestial events with such precision that they tracked not only annual solar cycles and lunar phases, but also much longer astronomical periods, including the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 26,000 years to complete and requires either centuries of continuous observation or inheritance of knowledge from even earlier sources who had done that observation. The Sumerian records suggested that this culture had understood that celestial mechanics followed patterns that could be calculated and predicted, that they had developed mathematical systems sophisticated enough to track planetary motions and stellar positions across millennia, and that they had encoded this knowledge in architectural monuments that would survive as permanent records, even if written documents were destroyed, creating, in essence, a stone library that could be read by anyone who understood the astronomical code they had built into the angles and alignments of their structures. Eleanor thought about places like Stonehenge, which tracks solar and lunar cycles with remarkable precision, despite being built supposedly by primitive peoples who should barely have understood the concept of seasons. Or the Great Pyramid of Giza, which aligns to true north with an accuracy that modern surveyors find impressive, and which incorporates into its dimensions mathematical constants like pi and phi that supposedly weren't discovered until thousands of years after its construction. Or the temples of Angkor Wat, which encode complex astronomical information in their architectural proportions and alignments, suggesting that whoever built these structures possessed knowledge that should not have been available to them, according to our standard chronology of human intellectual development. The fourth civilization apparently predicted their own destruction, according to the texts, foreseeing through their astronomical observations that a cosmic impact was coming. An encounter with cometary debris or an asteroid strike that would devastate the climate and shatter their carefully maintained society. And while they attempted to prepare and preserve their knowledge for whatever came after, the catastrophe, when it arrived, was too massive and too sudden for their preparations to matter much, leaving only scattered survivors who carried fragments of astronomical knowledge to various parts of the world, teaching whoever would listen about the importance of watching the skies and preserving information about celestial mechanics. Because the heavens were not simply beautiful or religiously significant, but actually dangerous, capable of throwing destruction at the earth with little warning and catastrophic consequences. The evidence for major cosmic impacts during the human era keeps accumulating, despite resistance from academics who prefer gradualist explanations for environmental changes, with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis gaining support from the discovery of impact markers across multiple continents, dating to approximately 12,800 years ago, exactly when the geological record shows sudden climate disruption, massive fires, megafauna extinctions, and the apparent collapse of Clovis culture in North America, suggesting that ancient warnings about destruction from the sky might have been based on actual historical events, rather than primitive fears of meteors and comets. The fifth civilization was described in the Sumerian texts as having achieved remarkable sophistication in metallurgy and what Eleanor translated as something like the capture of lightning, or harnessing the sky's fire. which sounded remarkably like descriptions of electricity. And, while mainstream scholarship would dismiss such interpretations as reading modern concepts back into ancient texts that must have meant something more primitive, Eleanor kept encountering archaeological anomalies that suggested perhaps the ancients had indeed developed electrical technologies, or at least understood electrical principles well enough to create batteries, circuits, and possibly even electroplating processes. The famous Baghdad batteries, clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods that could generate electrical current when filled with acidic liquid, were dismissed by many archaeologists as having some other purpose, despite the fact that they demonstrably function as primitive batteries and that experiments with replicas have shown they could have been used for electroplating gold onto other metals, a technique that supposedly wasn't invented until the modern era. And Eleanor wondered why we were so resistant to the idea that ancient peoples might have discovered electrical phenomena through careful observation and experimentation, especially when electricity itself is not some modern invention, but rather a fundamental force of nature that could have been noticed and studied by anyone who paid attention to lightning, static discharge, electric fish, and the various ways that certain materials produce electrical effects when rubbed together or subjected to chemical reactions. The texts suggested that the fifth civilization's downfall came not from external catastrophe, but from internal collapse, possibly related to over-reliance on technologies they couldn't fully control or understand the long-term consequences of. Using a warning that Eleanor found chillingly relevant to our own situation with nuclear power, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and climate-altering industrial processes, whose ultimate effects we won't understand until it's too late to reverse them. And she noted that the Sumerian scribes seemed to be suggesting that technological sophistication without wisdom was actually more dangerous than primitive simplicity, because advanced tools could destroy on scales that primitive tools never could. The archaeological record contains numerous out-of-place artifacts that suggest advanced metalworking in time periods where it shouldn't exist, including metallic spheres found in South African mines in rock formations hundreds of millions of years old, a hammer with a wooden handle embedded in 400-million-year-old rock, precision-machined metal objects in coal deposits that formed long before humans supposedly evolved. And while science insists these must be hoaxes or misidentifications, or natural formations that coincidentally resemble manufactured objects, Eleanor found herself questioning whether our certainty about the timeline of human technological development might be less solid than we pretended. Whether, perhaps, cycles of civilization had been happening for far longer than we imagined, with each one leaving only the most durable and confusing artifacts for the next cycle to puzzle over. The sixth civilization was the one the Sumerians described with the most detail and clarity, because this was the immediate predecessor culture whose survivors had directly taught the early Mesopotamians everything they knew, arriving in the aftermath of yet another catastrophic flood, this one the famous deluge recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and echoed in the biblical flood narrative and countless other ancient texts. And establishing themselves as the teachers and wisdom keepers who would transmit to primitive post-catastrophe populations fundamentals of agriculture, mathematics, writing, astronomy, architecture, and civic organization. This explained the puzzle that had bothered historians for over a century about why Sumerian civilization seemed to appear suddenly around 3500 BCE, with no gradual developmental phase, emerging fully formed with sophisticated writing systems, complex mathematics, including the base 60 number system we still use for measuring time and angles, advanced astronomy that tracked planetary movements and eclipse cycles, irrigation engineering that transformed desert into productive farmland, and urban planning that created cities capable of supporting populations in the tens of thousands, all of which should have required centuries of slow accumulation and refinement, but instead seemed to simply manifest as if someone had downloaded a complete cultural operating system into a population that had previously been scattered hunter-gatherers and primitive farmers. The Sumerian texts portrayed these survivors from the sixth civilization not as gods, though later cultures would mythologize them that way, but as refugees, desperately trying to preserve what they could of their knowledge before the last people who remembered the old world died and the information was lost forever. And Eleanor felt a profound sadness reading these accounts, imagining the desperation of people who had lost everything, whose entire world had been drowned beneath rising seas, who found themselves among populations that had survived the catastrophe, but had lost all sophisticated technology and social organization, and who now faced the monumental task of trying to teach complex ideas to people who lacked the educational foundation to understand them, forcing them to simplify and adapt their knowledge into forms that could be grasped and preserved by cultures starting essentially from scratch. The sixth civilization had apparently achieved a balanced approach to technology, combining insights from all previous cultures into a synthesis that worked with stone, sound, maritime capabilities, astronomy, and metallurgy in integrated ways. And their destruction by flood was particularly cruel, because, unlike the earlier catastrophes that had at least left some monumental structures standing, water had swallowed everything they built, taking their cities, their libraries, their workshops, their accumulated wealth and knowledge down into the depths, where it would be covered by sediment and forgotten, leaving only what the survivors could carry in their memories and what they could teach to whoever would listen in the shattered world that emerged after the waters finally receded. Eleanor sat surrounded by her translations and cross-references and notes, realizing that what the Sumerians had preserved was not mythology, but history. Not primitive attempts to explain the world through supernatural stories, but actual documentary records of human civilizations that had risen and fallen in repeating cycles, each one thinking it would be permanent, each one destroyed by forces it couldn't control or hadn't adequately prepared for, each one leaving only fragments for the next iteration to puzzle over. And she understood that we were not the first people to reach heights of sophistication and assume we were special, that the pattern had repeated at least 6 times before, and probably would repeat again, because nothing in human nature suggested we were any wiser or more humble than the civilizations that had come before us, and everything in our behavior suggested we were making exactly the same mistakes, building exactly the same kind of vulnerable, overconfident, centralized civilization that assumed it would last forever, right up until the moment it didn't, which meant that somewhere in our future, probably sooner than anyone wanted to admit, we would face our own reckoning, our own catastrophe. And the only question was whether enough knowledge would survive to give the next civilization a better chance, or whether we would simply reset completely, forcing humanity to climb back up from primitive conditions yet again, forever trapped in a cycle we couldn't break because we refused to learn from the warnings that earlier peoples had tried so desperately to preserve. For exactly this moment, when we might finally be ready to listen and understand what they were trying to tell us about the terrible fragility of everything we had built, and the certainty that without profound changes in how we approached technology, environment, and our own hubris, we would join them in the long list of civilizations that had once seemed eternal, but had become nothing more than mysterious ruins and half-remembered myths for whoever came after, to puzzle over and probably dismiss as primitive superstition, rather than the urgent warnings they actually were. Modern archaeology operates under a set of assumptions so fundamental and so rarely questioned that they have essentially become articles of faith, creating a kind of intellectual framework that determines not only how we interpret evidence, but also what evidence we're willing to acknowledge in the first place. And this framework insists that human civilization developed in a neat, linear progression from simple to complex, from primitive hunter-gatherers to agricultural villages to cities to technological societies, with each stage necessarily preceding the next, in an orderly sequence that conveniently matches our preconceptions about how progress works. Which means that any evidence contradicting this narrative, any artifact or structure or anomaly that suggests perhaps the timeline wasn't quite so simple or quite so linear, tends to get filed away in what amounts to an archaeological rejection pile, a metaphorical drawer labelled "doesn't fit the approved story," where inconvenient discoveries go to be forgotten by everyone except the occasional maverick researcher willing to risk professional credibility by suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we've been getting some fundamental things wrong about when and how human technological sophistication developed. Eleanor Hartwick, after years of studying Sumerian texts that insisted 6 previous civilizations had risen and fallen before the one that invented writing, found herself increasingly drawn to this rejected evidence, this collection of anomalies and out-of-place artifacts that mainstream archaeology had deemed either fraudulent or misinterpreted, or simply too problematic to acknowledge. Because if the Sumerians were telling the truth about cyclical rises and falls of human civilization, then these anomalies might not be anomalies at all, but rather exactly the kind of fragmentary remnants you would expect to find from cultures that had been almost entirely erased by catastrophe and time. The problem with dating ancient artifacts and structures is that our methods only work reliably under certain conditions and within certain timeframes. And while radiocarbon dating has revolutionized our ability to establish chronologies for organic materials from roughly the last 50,000 years, it becomes increasingly unreliable as you approach that outer limit, and completely useless beyond it. Which means that for anything older than 50 millennia, we're essentially guessing based on geological context and stylistic assumptions. And even within the reliable range of carbon dating, the method depends on assumptions about atmospheric carbon ratios that may not have held constant during periods of catastrophic environmental disruption, like massive volcanic eruptions or cosmic impacts, or sudden climate shifts that would have altered the very baseline against which we're measuring everything else. Moreover, we have no reliable method for directly dating stone, which means that all those megalithic structures scattered around the world, those massive constructions that seem to defy explanation in terms of the primitive technologies we assume were available when they were supposedly built, could actually be far older than we think, built during previous cycles of civilization and simply reused or repurposed by later cultures who found them already standing and decided to incorporate them into their own architectural projects. The way medieval Europeans built churches using stones from Roman temples without anyone later assuming the churches themselves dated to Roman times. Yet, we make exactly that kind of assumption error when we date ancient megalithic sites based on the most recent artifacts found in association with them, rather than considering that those artifacts might represent later use of already ancient structures. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of how a single archaeological discovery can completely overturn established assumptions about what primitive peoples were supposedly capable of accomplishing. Because this site, which consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures and decorated with sophisticated three-dimensional carvings of animals and abstract symbols, was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE by people who went to enormous effort to preserve it beneath layers of fill dirt, and radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the original construction phase pushes the site back to approximately 9600 BCE or earlier, making it roughly 11,600 years old at minimum, which places its construction firmly in the pre-agricultural era, when humans were supposedly just beginning to experiment with domesticating plants, and had not yet developed the social organization, the surplus food production, the specialized labor forces, or the architectural knowledge that should have been prerequisites for building monumental stone structures requiring the quarrying, transportation, and precise placement of pillars weighing up to 20 tons each. The implications are staggering when you actually stop to think about them, rather than just reading about the site in archaeological journals that describe it as surprisingly sophisticated, and then move on without addressing the fundamental problem it creates for our understanding of human cultural development. Because Göbekli Tepe suggests either that hunter-gatherers were far more capable of complex social organization and construction projects than we've given them credit for, or that the people who built it weren't actually primitive hunter-gatherers at all, but rather survivors or descendants of an earlier, more advanced culture, who retained enough knowledge and organizational ability to construct something monumental, even in the aftermath of whatever catastrophe had reduced them to a semi-nomadic existence. The precision with which ancient megalithic structures were constructed presents another problem that archaeology consistently underestimates or simply ignores in favor of explanations, involving copper tools, wooden rollers, and massive amounts of human labor guided by religious fervor, as if motivation alone could overcome the physical and engineering challenges involved in cutting and moving and placing stones weighing hundreds of tons with such exactitude that modern engineers openly admit they would struggle to replicate the work, even with contemporary equipment, laser levels, and computer-aided design programs. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, part of the larger Tiahuanaco complex, you find massive stone blocks with perfectly flat surfaces, precise 90-degree angles, and complex interlocking joints that look like they were machined rather than hand-carved. And while archaeologists insist these were created using stone hammers and patience, nobody has successfully demonstrated how you would achieve machine precision flatness across a surface measuring several square meters using primitive tools, or how you would create the perfectly straight channels and holes. Drilled into extremely hard andesite and diorite stone without metal drill bits, and mechanical force far exceeding what human muscle power could generate, even with the most efficient lever systems. The standard explanation involves assuming that ancient peoples had unlimited time and unlimited patience and unlimited willingness to slowly pound away at stone until it achieved the desired shape. But this explanation conveniently ignores the fact that time and patience don't produce precision. They produce approximate results with inevitable irregularities. Whereas what we actually see at sites like Pumapunku or the Osirian in Egypt or the stone walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru are surfaces and angles and joints that demonstrate precision comparable to modern machining, suggesting either that the ancients had access to tools and techniques we haven't accounted for in our models of their technological capabilities, or that these structures date from periods when more sophisticated tools were available during previous cycles of civilization that had developed different technological pathways, leading to capabilities we've lost and forgotten. The global distribution of massive megalithic structures built using similar techniques of precision stone cutting and astronomical alignment presents yet another puzzle that mainstream archaeology addresses by assuming independent invention. The idea that cultures separated by vast distances and with no contact somehow coincidentally developed virtually identical approaches to monumental architecture, aligned their structures to the same celestial events using the same sophisticated mathematical principles, and achieved similar levels of precision in stone cutting using presumably different tool sets and techniques, which is technically possible but becomes statistically improbable when you consider how many fundamental similarities exist between megalithic sites in Egypt, Peru, Bolivia, Lebanon, Turkey, India, China, and various Pacific islands, all supposedly built by completely unrelated cultures who somehow converged on remarkably similar solutions to architectural challenges without any knowledge exchange or cultural contact. The alternative explanation, which gets dismissed as fringe speculation despite making more logical sense, is that these structures represent remnants of a previous global civilization, or perhaps multiple connected civilizations, that had developed sophisticated stoneworking techniques and astronomical knowledge, and then spread or transmitted that knowledge across vast geographical distances before being destroyed by catastrophe, leaving behind monumental architecture that survived precisely because it was built on such massive scale with such durable materials. While everything else, the wooden buildings, the textile arts, the written records on perishable materials, the portable tools and technologies, decayed and vanished, leaving later peoples to marvel at stone structures they couldn't replicate and didn't fully understand, but could recognize as important enough to preserve and often to incorporate into their own religious and civic architecture. The evidence for catastrophic flooding at the end of the last ice age is not controversial in geological terms, because we can measure ancient sea levels through various methods, including coral reef formations, sediment cores, and raised beach terraces. And these measurements consistently show that sea levels rose approximately 400 feet between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the massive ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere melted, with some periods of particularly rapid rise that would have transformed coastlines within a human lifetime, drowning vast areas of low-lying land where, logically, most people would have been living, because coastal regions offered abundant food resources, moderate climates, easy transportation via boats, and all the other advantages that still make coastlines the most densely populated areas of the modern world. What's controversial is not whether this flooding happened, but rather what it destroyed. Because acknowledging that millions of people might have been displaced or killed by rising seas, and that entire sophisticated coastal civilizations might have been swallowed by the ocean, would require confronting the possibility that much of human history, from the period before the floods, is now underwater, buried beneath hundreds of feet of water and covered by thousands of years of marine sediment, making it effectively invisible to conventional archaeological survey methods that focus on land-based sites and only occasionally venture into underwater archaeology in relatively shallow areas where visibility and access make research feasible. The discovery of underwater structures and formations that appear artificial but exist in locations and at depths that would require them to predate the flooding, if they are indeed human-made, consistently generates controversy because admitting these might be remnants of pre-flood civilizations would overturn established chronologies and force a fundamental reassessment of when humans developed the capacity for large-scale construction projects and urban settlement patterns. So instead, these discoveries tend to get explained away as natural formations that coincidentally resemble walls, roads, foundations, and other architectural features, with mainstream archaeology taking the position that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, while simultaneously refusing to fund or support the kind of extensive underwater archaeological research that would be necessary to gather such evidence, creating a convenient circular argument where evidence doesn't exist because we won't look for it, and we won't look for it because the evidence doesn't exist. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, discovered in 1987, presents a particularly striking example of this dynamic, with its massive stone formations featuring flat surfaces, right angles, apparent stairways, and tool marks that look suspiciously artificial. Located at depths requiring sea levels approximately 130 feet lower than present, which would date the structure to at least 10,000 years ago, if it is human-made. Yet, mainstream archaeology has largely dismissed it as a natural geological formation, despite the fact that no geologist has successfully explained how natural erosion processes would produce such features, or why similar formations don't appear elsewhere along the same coastline, while the few archaeologists willing to suggest it might be artificial risk professional marginalization for proposing something that doesn't fit the approved timeline of Japanese cultural development. Ancient texts describing technologies that supposedly shouldn't have existed present another category of evidence that gets systematically dismissed or reinterpreted as mythological fancy rather than possible. Historical records of actual devices and capabilities that have been lost, because our assumption that technological development follows a single linear path from primitive to advanced means we can't conceive of ancient peoples having developed certain technologies that we consider modern inventions, even when the underlying physics and basic principles would have been accessible to anyone who experimented systematically and accumulated knowledge across generations. The Vaimanika Shastra and other ancient Sanskrit texts describe vimanas, which are variously translated as flying machines or aerial vehicles, with detailed specifications about construction, propulsion, and navigation that sound remarkably like descriptions of aircraft. And while modern scholars insist these must be purely mythological or symbolic representations of something else, it's worth noting that the descriptions include specific technical details about materials, measurements, and flight characteristics that would be oddly specific if the authors were just making up fantasy stories, suggesting perhaps they were describing things they had seen or heard about, even if they didn't fully understand the underlying technology. The way a medieval person might describe a modern airplane as a metal bird that breathes fire and carries people through the sky, which would sound like pure fantasy to other medieval people, but would actually be a reasonably accurate description of something that exists, even if the describer doesn't understand aerodynamics or jet propulsion. Greek fire, the legendary incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire that burned even on water and supposedly couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, was long dismissed as exaggerated myth until modern analysis suggested it was probably a form of petroleum-based napalm, requiring sophisticated understanding of chemistry and distillation processes that we didn't think the Byzantines possessed. Which raises the question of what other legendary weapons and technologies described in ancient texts might actually have been real devices whose operating principles we don't understand because we assume ancient peoples couldn't possibly have developed such things. And the fact that the exact formula for Greek fire was kept so secret that it was eventually lost entirely, leaving later generations unable to recreate it, should serve as a cautionary tale about how quickly sophisticated knowledge can vanish when the chain of transmission is broken by war, conquest, or cultural collapse. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, and dated to approximately 100 BCE, is an extraordinarily complex mechanical computer, using bronze gears to calculate astronomical positions and predict eclipses. And its existence was so incompatible with our assumptions about ancient Greek technological capabilities that it took decades of research using X-ray imaging and modern analysis techniques before scholars finally accepted that yes, someone in the ancient world had built a geared analog computer of remarkable sophistication, which should make us wonder what other impossible technologies might have existed, in forms we haven't yet discovered or recognized. Because this device only survived because it happened to be on a ship that sank in relatively shallow water in a location where it would eventually be found by sponge divers. And if it had sunk in deeper water, or been lost on land where bronze corrodes away to unrecognizable fragments, we would never have known such technology existed, and would continue insisting that complex geared mechanisms were impossible before the medieval period. The problem of out-of-place artifacts, objects that appear in geological contexts where they absolutely should not exist, according to established timelines of human technological development, presents perhaps the most direct challenge to conventional archaeological narratives, because these are not ambiguous structures that might be natural formations, or ancient texts that might be metaphorical, but rather manufactured objects made of metal or shaped with precision that can only result from intelligent design. Found embedded in rock formations or coal deposits that formed millions of years before humans supposedly evolved, let alone developed metallurgy and manufacturing capabilities, which should be impossible, and therefore gets explained away as hoaxes, misidentifications, or contamination, where modern objects somehow got mixed into ancient deposits through undetected geological processes. The Koso artifact, discovered in 1961 inside a geode that appeared to be at least 500,000 years old, contained what looked like a spark plug or similar mechanical device with a ceramic core, metallic components, and a spring or coil. And while the discoverers initially believed they had found evidence of impossibly ancient technology, skeptics later claimed it was probably just a 1920s champion spark plug that had somehow become encrusted with mineral deposits to create the appearance of great age. Though this explanation requires accepting that mineral encrustation sufficient to make an object appear 500,000 years old could occur in less than 40 years, which seems to involve its own set of implausible assumptions about geological processes. And, regardless of the true age of this particular object, the existence of multiple similar discoveries of manufactured metal objects in contexts where they shouldn't exist, according to conventional chronology, suggests either that our dating methods are more fallible than we admit, or that human-like technological capabilities extend much further back in time than we're comfortable acknowledging. The London hammer, discovered in 1936 in Texas, embedded in rock formation that supposedly dated to the Cretaceous period over 100 million years ago, consists of an iron hammerhead with remnants of a wooden handle. And while skeptics insist it must be a modern tool that became encased in a concretion of minerals, rather than actually being embedded in ancient rock, the fact remains that someone found a manufactured metal object in what appeared to be solid stone. And similar discoveries keep occurring, often enough to suggest a pattern rather than isolated hoaxes or misunderstandings, including the various metallic spheres found by miners in South Africa in rock formations dating to billions of years ago. Perfectly round objects with parallel grooves around their equators that look manufactured rather than natural. Though mainstream geology insists they must be mineral concretions, despite not being able to adequately explain how natural processes would produce such regular geometric forms. The uncomfortable truth that archaeology continues to avoid confronting is that our timeline of human and pre-human technological development is based largely on the assumption that we will find a neat progression of increasingly sophisticated artifacts as we examine increasingly recent geological periods, with the corollary assumption that anything too sophisticated found in too ancient a context must be either misdated or fraudulent or misidentified. But this creates an unfalsifiable model where evidence contradicting the model automatically gets rejected as invalid, preventing us from ever discovering if the model itself is wrong, because we've structured our entire intellectual framework to dismiss as impossible the very evidence that would prove our framework inadequate. The question Eleanor kept returning to as she researched these anomalies and out-of-place artifacts was not whether every single disputed discovery represented genuine evidence of ancient advanced technology, because certainly some were misidentifications, and some were probably hoaxes, and some were cases of natural formations that happened to resemble manufactured objects. But rather, why the academic establishment was so uniformly hostile to even considering the possibility that some of these anomalies might be legitimate evidence of technologies and capabilities that didn't fit the approved narrative. Because science is supposed to adjust theories to match evidence, rather than rejecting evidence that contradicts theories, yet archaeology seemed to have inverted this principle, deciding that the timeline of human development was essentially settled, and that any evidence suggesting otherwise must be flawed evidence, rather than evidence of flawed timelines. The Sumerians had recorded that 6 civilizations preceded theirs, each one reaching heights of technological sophistication through different pathways. Each one destroyed so completely that almost nothing remained except fragmentary remnants that later peoples would struggle to understand or explain. And if that account was accurate, then you would expect to find exactly what Eleanor was finding in her research. A scattered collection of anomalies and impossibilities and out-of-place sophistication that mainstream archaeology had filed away and forgotten. Because acknowledging these artifacts would require admitting that human history was far longer, far more complex, and far more cyclical than the neat, progressive narrative we had constructed to make ourselves feel special and advanced and unique. When the reality might be that we were simply the latest iteration in a pattern that had repeated multiple times before and would probably repeat again, because nothing in human nature suggested we were fundamentally different from, or wiser than, the peoples who came before us. And the evidence we kept ignoring was perhaps the most important evidence of all. The fragments and whispers and impossible artifacts that were trying to tell us that civilization was more fragile and more cyclical and more prone to catastrophic collapse than we wanted to believe. Which meant that understanding this rejected evidence might be essential to breaking the cycle, rather than simply repeating it with different technologies and the same, ultimately fatal combination of sophistication and hubris that had doomed every previous attempt at building something permanent in a universe that seemed determined to remind humans at regular intervals that nothing we build will last forever, and that forgetting this lesson is perhaps the most dangerous form of ignorance any civilization can embrace. The pattern that emerged from Eleanor's years of research into Sumerian records and their accounts of previous civilizations was not the comforting narrative of steady human progress toward greater safety and security that modern people tend to assume characterizes our species' journey from primitive vulnerability to technological mastery, but rather a far more disturbing cycle of rise and catastrophic fall that repeated with terrible regularity across timescales so vast that individual human lives couldn't perceive the pattern, the way an insect living for a single day couldn't comprehend the concept of seasons or annual cycles. And what the Sumerians had apparently understood, what they had tried to preserve in their meticulous record-keeping for whatever civilizations might come after them, was that this cycle operated according to forces largely beyond human control, with each iteration of civilization lasting somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 years before being destroyed by catastrophes that ranged from cosmic impacts to climatic disruptions to geological convulsions that transformed the planetary environment so completely and so suddenly that even the most sophisticated societies had no meaningful defense against them. The Sumerians calculated that their own culture had emerged approximately 5,000 years after the destruction of the sixth civilization, which meant that roughly 12,000 years had passed since the last major reset. And if the cycle held to its historical pattern, which averaged destructions occurring every 10 to 20,000 years based on the records they had compiled, then their civilization was approaching, or perhaps already, in the danger zone, where catastrophe became not just possible, but increasingly probable. And Eleanor realized with a chill that by that same calculation, our own civilization, emerging from the same post-flood baseline as the Sumerians, but now extending 12,000 years beyond that last major reset, was living on borrowed time, according to a pattern that had already repeated at least 6 times in human history. The methods of destruction that had ended previous civilizations, according to the Sumerian accounts, and supported by increasingly compelling geological and astronomical evidence, were not the gradual declines that modern historians prefer to describe when discussing the fall of Rome or the collapse of the Maya, but rather sudden, catastrophic events that could devastate a civilization within years or even days, leaving survivors scattered and traumatized and stripped of the technological infrastructure and specialized knowledge that had defined their societies. Forced to restart, essentially, from subsistence level, while trying desperately to preserve whatever fragments of sophisticated understanding they could pass on to descendants who would live in a much harsher and more primitive world than the one their ancestors had known. Cosmic impacts represented perhaps the most terrifying category of civilization-ending catastrophe, because they arrived with minimal warning and carried consequences far beyond the immediate destruction of the impact itself. As Eleanor learned when she began researching the Younger Dryas event that had occurred approximately 12,800 years ago, an incident that geological evidence now increasingly supported as having been caused by a massive comet fragmenting in Earth's atmosphere and raining destruction across the northern hemisphere, triggering continental-scale wildfires that could be detected in ice cores and sediment layers, causing sudden climatic shifts that plunged the planet back into near-glacial conditions after a period of warming, and, apparently, contributing to the extinction of dozens of megafauna species, including mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and numerous other large animals that had survived previous ice ages but couldn't survive the combination of environmental catastrophe and human hunting pressure. What particularly disturbed Eleanor about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which was gaining scientific support despite initial resistance from researchers who preferred gradualist explanations for environmental changes, was the evidence emerging that North America had hosted a relatively sophisticated culture during the period just before this catastrophe. The Clovis people, who had developed distinctive stone tools, established wide-ranging trade networks, and apparently achieved population levels and social organization far beyond what we typically associate with Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, all of which vanished remarkably quickly around the time of the impacts, with archaeological sites showing evidence of sudden abandonment and the Clovis tool tradition essentially disappearing from the record, as if the knowledge of how to make these sophisticated implements had been lost, along with the people who carried that knowledge. The parallels to the Sumerian accounts of previous civilizations destroyed by cosmic catastrophe were impossible to ignore, and Eleanor found herself wondering whether the Clovis culture might have been more advanced than the stone tools suggested, whether perhaps they represented survivors or descendants of an even earlier sophisticated society who had already been rebuilding from a previous catastrophe when the Younger Dryas impacts struck and reset everything again. Because if you destroyed our own civilization and future archaeologists only found our stone buildings and ceramic artifacts, while all the metal, plastic, and electronic components had corroded away to nothing, they might similarly underestimate how advanced we actually were, based on the limited remains that survived the intervening millennia. Flooding as a mechanism of civilizational destruction appeared repeatedly in both the Sumerian records and the geological evidence. And unlike the catastrophic but relatively localized damage from even large cosmic impacts, flooding could drown entire coastlines and transform the geography of continents, erasing not just cities and populations, but the very land they had built upon, submerging evidence of their existence beneath hundreds of feet of water, where it would be covered by marine sediment and rendered effectively invisible to later peoples, who would have no reason to suspect that vast civilizations had once thrived on landscapes now deep underwater. The end of the last ice age witnessed sea level rises that are difficult to fully comprehend from our modern perspective of relatively stable coastlines, with estimates suggesting that global sea levels increased by approximately 400 feet between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. Not as a gradual and steady rise that people could easily adapt to by slowly moving settlements inland over many generations, but rather in pulses and surges that could raise water levels by dozens of feet within a human lifetime, particularly during periods when massive ice dams holding back glacial lakes suddenly failed and released enormous volumes of fresh water into the oceans, or when ice sheets reached critical instability points and collapsed in geologically rapid fashion, sending walls of water surging across low-lying coastal plains where, by all logical analysis, the majority of human population would have been concentrated, because coastlines offered the richest and most diverse food resources, the most moderate climates, the easiest transportation routes via boats, and all the other advantages that still make coastal regions the most densely populated areas of our contemporary world. Eleanor calculated that if even 10% of the global human population had been living in areas that were subsequently flooded by post-glacial sea level rise, which seemed like an extremely conservative estimate given how much prime real estate was drowned and how strongly humans are drawn to coastal environments, then you were talking about the deaths or displacement of millions of people, and the complete destruction of whatever cities, agricultural systems, and cultural institutions they had developed, with survivors forced to retreat to higher ground that was often less hospitable and less capable of supporting large populations, leading to societal collapse even among those who didn't physically drown, because the resource base that had supported their civilization no longer existed in accessible form. The fact that over 200 distinct cultural traditions around the world preserved detailed flood myths describing world-destroying deluges that killed most of humanity and forced survivors to start over, often with help from gods or culture heroes who taught them agriculture and building and other civilized arts, suggested that these were not independent inventions of similar stories, but rather cultural memories of actual catastrophic flooding events that had been traumatic enough to burn themselves into human consciousness and get passed down through oral traditions for thousands of years. And the remarkable consistency of details across geographically separated cultures, the warning of coming waters, the building of boats or seeking of high ground, the birds sent out to find land, the sacrifice or covenant made afterward, implied a common experiential basis that was later modified and adapted to fit different cultural contexts, but retained its core narrative because that narrative was rooted in historical truth rather than pure imagination. Solar events represented another category of civilization-ending catastrophe that the ancient records seemed to reference, and that modern science was only beginning to understand as a genuine existential threat. And Eleanor found herself researching the Carrington event of 1859, the largest solar storm in recorded history, which had sent such intense geomagnetic disruption toward Earth that it caused auroras visible as far south as the Caribbean, induced electrical currents strong enough to shock telegraph operators and set their equipment on fire, and generally wreaked havoc on the relatively primitive electrical systems of mid-19th century technology. What terrified her about the Carrington event was not what it had done in 1859, when human civilization depended minimally on electrical infrastructure and could shrug off the disruption relatively easily, but rather what a similar or larger solar storm would do to contemporary civilization, which has become so utterly dependent on electrical power, electronic communications, computer networks, and satellite systems, that a sufficiently powerful geomagnetic storm could effectively destroy the entire technological infrastructure of modern society in a matter of hours, frying transformers and power grids that would take months or years to replace, destroying satellites that we depend on for GPS navigation and global communications, corrupting computer systems and data storage facilities, and generally sending us back to pre-electrical civilization overnight, with no gradual transition period to adjust or prepare. And, unlike the solar storm of 1859, we would have billions of people dependent on just-in-time supply chains, refrigerated food storage, electrically pumped water systems, and countless other technologies that would simply stop functioning, leading to cascading failures that would kill more people through starvation, disease, and social collapse than the solar storm itself directly affected. The geological record preserved evidence of even more powerful solar events than the Carrington storm, with studies of tree rings and ice cores revealing the signature of massive solar proton events that had occurred in 774 CE and 993 CE, producing spikes in atmospheric carbon-14 that suggested solar storms perhaps 20 times more powerful than the Carrington event. And while these apparently hadn't caused civilizational collapse in the medieval world, because that world simply wasn't vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption in the way ours is, Eleanor couldn't help but calculate what would happen if a similar event struck today. And the answer was that modern civilization would effectively end within weeks. Not because the solar storm would directly kill billions of people, but because it would destroy the electrical and electronic infrastructure that keeps billions of people alive. And without electricity, the water stops flowing. The food stops being refrigerated and transported. The hospitals can't function. The communication systems go dark. And within a remarkably short time, you have mass starvation, epidemic disease, and the complete breakdown of the social order that depends on functioning infrastructure to maintain stability. All because we had built our entire civilization on technologies that were extraordinarily vulnerable to a type of event that occurred regularly on astronomical timescales, even if it seemed rare from the perspective of human lifetimes. Supervolcanic eruptions represented yet another mechanism of catastrophic destruction that the geological record demonstrated had occurred multiple times during the period of human existence on Earth, with the Toba eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, serving as the most dramatic example. An explosion so massive that it ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, created a volcanic winter that may have lasted years or even decades, and according to some genetic analyses, apparently reduced the global human population to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals, creating a genetic bottleneck that can still be detected in modern human DNA. The terrifying aspect of supervolcanoes was not just their raw destructive power, which was sufficient to bury entire regions under feet of ash and pumice, while simultaneously triggering global climate disruption that would destroy agricultural systems across continents, but rather the fact that they provided essentially no warning, offering at most a few days or weeks of increased seismic activity before the catastrophic eruption occurred. Nowhere near enough time to evacuate populations, or preserve knowledge, or take any meaningful defensive measures beyond hoping you were far enough away from the eruption center to survive the initial blast, and then hoping you could find enough food to survive the years of volcanic winter that would follow, as ash and sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere blocked sunlight and crashed global temperatures. Eleanor researched the locations of known supervolcanoes that were technically overdue for eruptions according to their historical patterns, including Yellowstone in North America, which last erupted catastrophically approximately 640,000 years ago, and showed signs of continued activity with its geysers and hot springs and measurable ground deformation. And she realized that if Yellowstone erupted at the scale it had in previous events, it would bury much of the central United States under ash, devastate agriculture across the northern hemisphere through climate disruption, and likely kill hundreds of millions of people, directly or indirectly. And yet, this threat received relatively little attention or preparation, because it seemed abstract and unlikely from the perspective of individual human lifetimes. The same kind of temporal blindness that had probably affected every previous civilization that was destroyed by low-frequency but high-consequence catastrophes. Because humans are extraordinarily bad at preparing for events that have never happened in living memory, even when the geological and historical record clearly demonstrates that such events occur regularly on longer timescales. The comparison between ancient civilizations and our own in terms of vulnerability to catastrophic collapse revealed what Eleanor considered the most disturbing irony of technological progress, which was that, in many ways, we had become simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than any previous civilization, having developed capabilities that would seem godlike to ancient peoples, while also creating dependencies and centralized systems that could fail catastrophically in ways that decentralized ancient societies could not. Because if you destroyed Rome at the height of its power, you would still have thousands of towns and villages across the empire that could continue functioning more or less normally, with local agriculture, local crafts, local governance, and most of the knowledge needed for survival distributed widely among the population. Our civilization, by contrast, had concentrated knowledge in specialists and institutions and digital storage systems to such an extreme degree that the average person had no meaningful understanding of how to produce food, purify water, make clothing, construct shelter, or preserve knowledge without relying on technological systems and supply chains that could be disrupted by any number of catastrophic events. And Eleanor conducted an informal survey among her colleagues and friends, asking them to explain how various everyday technologies actually worked, or how they would perform basic survival tasks without modern tools. And the results were sobering, with almost nobody able to adequately explain how to smelt metal from ore, how to make antibiotics from available materials, how to generate electricity, how to build a solar panel, or even how to identify edible plants in their local environment without access to guidebooks or internet searches. The knowledge problem that would face survivors of any catastrophic collapse of modern civilization was fundamentally different and more severe than what survivors of ancient catastrophes would have confronted, because ancient peoples lived in a world where most adults possessed practical knowledge of food production, tool-making, shelter construction, and other survival necessities. With technological sophistication, meaning you knew more efficient or specialized ways of doing things, rather than being completely helpless without specialized equipment. Whereas modern people had outsourced almost all practical knowledge to systems and specialists, with the result that a collapse of those systems would leave survivors in a situation where they knew intellectually that various technologies existed and had once been common, but had absolutely no idea how to recreate them without access to existing examples, instruction manuals, or the complex supply chains that provided refined materials and specialized components. Eleanor realized that if a solar storm wiped out the electrical grid tomorrow, most of the information we had accumulated and stored digitally would become inaccessible within days as backup power systems failed, within months as solid-state storage degraded without climate control, and within years as computer hardware corroded and became unusable, with no physical books or documents to preserve that knowledge, because we had increasingly moved everything to digital formats that we assumed would be more permanent and accessible than paper, not recognizing that digital storage required constant technological infrastructure to remain readable, and was actually far more fragile than the clay tablets that preserved Sumerian knowledge for 5,000 years, or the stone monuments that had lasted for tens of thousands of years, recording astronomical information that survivors could still read and use long after the civilization that created them had vanished. The arrogance factor that characterized every civilization that had collapsed was something Eleanor saw reflected perfectly in contemporary attitudes toward our own permanence and our dismissal of warnings from history. Because humans seemed psychologically incapable of really believing that their own civilization could fail the way previous ones had, always finding reasons why this time would be different, why our technology or organization or understanding had finally reached the level where we could prevent or survive catastrophes that had destroyed everyone before us. And this pattern appeared repeatedly throughout history, with Romans convinced that Rome would last forever, even as the empire crumbled. Maya building cities they expected to thrive for thousands of years before abandoning them within generations. Anasazi constructing elaborate cliff dwellings for a civilization they assumed would continue indefinitely, before climate shifts forced complete abandonment. And countless other examples of peoples who had invested enormous resources in permanent infrastructure because they couldn't imagine a future where their society didn't exist. Contemporary civilization demonstrated the same pattern with even greater intensity, building cities in earthquake zones and on coastlines vulnerable to sea level rise and hurricanes, constructing infrastructure designed to last decades when we faced threats that could destroy everything far sooner, investing in long-term projects and retirement plans and multi-generational institutions, as if we were certain that the technological and social systems supporting all of this would continue functioning indefinitely. And Eleanor found it darkly amusing that we simultaneously acknowledged, intellectually, that climate change and resource depletion and nuclear weapons and biotechnology and artificial intelligence all posed existential risks to civilization, while continuing to live and plan as if none of those risks would actually materialize in ways that seriously disrupted our comfortable assumptions about the future. The Sumerian records that Eleanor had spent years studying were not abstract historical curiosities or interesting myths about vanished peoples, but rather urgent warnings from a civilization that had understood itself to be the seventh iteration in a cycle of rise and fall. A civilization that had possessed enough humility to recognize that previous, sophisticated societies had believed themselves permanent before being destroyed, and that the Sumerians themselves would likely face similar catastrophe eventually. And they had preserved this knowledge not because they thought it would prevent their own collapse, because they seemed to understand that the forces involved were largely beyond human control, but because they wanted whoever came after to at least have the information, to understand the pattern, to recognize that civilization was a fragile and temporary state, rather than humanity's natural condition or permanent achievement. Eleanor realized that we were living approximately 12,000 years after the last major reset event, the floods that had ended the sixth civilization and forced humanity to rebuild from scattered survivors. And by the Sumerian calculations of typical cycle lengths, we were already in the period where catastrophe became not just possible, but likely, where the accumulated probability of cosmic impacts or solar storms or supervolcanic eruptions or some combination of disasters reached levels that should have terrified us into preparing far more seriously than we actually were. But instead, we seemed determined to ignore the warnings, to dismiss the evidence, to assume that ancient peoples were primitive and superstitious, and that their records of previous catastrophes were mythology rather than history. And in doing so, we were repeating exactly the same pattern of arrogance and willful blindness that had characterized every civilization that had fallen before us, which suggested that perhaps we weren't actually more intelligent or more capable than our predecessors, but merely more technologically sophisticated in ways that made us simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable. And that unless something fundamental changed in how we approached the question of civilizational fragility and catastrophic risk, we were essentially guaranteed to become the seventh fallen civilization, recorded in whatever archives the eighth civilization might eventually compile, assuming anyone survived to compile them at all. The profound shift in perspective that Eleanor Hartwick experienced after years of immersing herself in Sumerian records and archaeological anomalies was not simply an academic adjustment to her understanding of human history, but rather a fundamental reframing of what it means to live in what we call advanced civilization. Because once you truly internalize the possibility that we are not the first people to reach these heights of technological sophistication, not the first to believe ourselves unique and permanent and destined to endure, but rather merely the latest iteration in a cycle that has repeated at least 6 times before, with each previous attempt ending in catastrophic collapse and near total erasure, everything about our contemporary world begins to look different, more temporary, more fragile, more suffused with the same arrogant assumptions that probably characterized the thinking of everyone who came before us, right up until the moment their certainty shattered, along with their civilization. She found herself increasingly viewing modern society through the lens of a future archaeologist, imagining how our achievements and failures would appear to researchers 10,000 years from now, if anyone survived to conduct such research. And what struck her most forcefully was the realization that many of the things we consider marks of our advancement would actually make our civilization harder to understand and easier to underestimate than previous cultures that had built in stone and preserved knowledge in more durable forms. Because we had optimized for convenience and efficiency in the present, without considering how our choices would affect the long-term preservation of information about who we were and what we had accomplished. The geological signature that our civilization would leave behind was something Eleanor began researching with morbid fascination. And what she discovered was that future researchers examining rock strata from our era would encounter a distinctive layer unlike anything that had appeared previously in Earth's history. A band of sediment containing plastics, synthetic chemicals, radioactive isotopes, and industrial pollutants that would mark the Anthropocene as clearly as the iridium layer marked the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. And while this permanent record would prove that an industrialized civilization had existed, it would also raise disturbing questions for those future archaeologists about what kind of people would create a technology like plastic that they knew would persist in the environment essentially forever, producing billions of tons of waste that would slowly break down into microplastics, now detectable in every ecosystem on Earth, including in Antarctic ice cores and in the deepest ocean trenches, and in the tissues of every living organism studied, suggesting a civilization so focused on immediate convenience that it was willing to permanently contaminate its own planet with indestructible trash. The irony that Eleanor found particularly bitter was that this plastic layer would be one of the most enduring legacies of our civilization, outlasting almost everything else we had created. So that future researchers would know with certainty that someone had developed polymer chemistry and manufacturing at industrial scale, but might have no idea what else that civilization had achieved, because all the more impressive accomplishments would have corroded away to nothing while the trash remained. The nuclear signature of our era represented another permanent marker that would puzzle and disturb future archaeologists, because the radioactive isotopes released by atomic bomb testing during the mid-20th century, particularly isotopes like plutonium-239 and cesium-137, that don't occur naturally in measurable quantities, were now detectable everywhere on Earth, in soil samples and ice cores and sediment layers, creating an unmistakable chronological marker that would inform anyone with sufficient scientific knowledge that at some point between approximately 1945 and 1963, someone on this planet had not only discovered how to split atomic nuclei, but had proceeded to detonate hundreds of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, contaminating the entire globe with radioactive fallout in what must have been either the most catastrophic war imaginable or the most insane series of weapons tests conceivable. Future researchers examining this evidence would know that we had achieved the capability to release energies comparable to the sun itself. That we had literally torn apart the fundamental building blocks of matter and unleashed that power across our world. And then they would presumably look around at whatever ruins remained and wonder what possibly could have gone wrong after achieving such godlike capabilities. Why a civilization that could split atoms couldn't manage to prevent its own collapse? What fatal flaw in human nature, or social organization, or strategic thinking had led us to develop such immense power, and then apparently fail to use it wisely enough to ensure our own survival? Assuming, of course, that it was indeed our collapse that they were investigating, rather than our ongoing thriving. Though Eleanor's research had left her increasingly pessimistic about which of those futures was more likely. The digital ghost problem that would haunt efforts to understand our civilization was something that particularly troubled Eleanor, because it represented a fundamental irony of technological progress, which was that we had become extraordinarily efficient at creating and storing information, while simultaneously making that information more fragile and more dependent on specific technological infrastructure than any previous civilization had managed. And the result was that we were producing more records and documentation and creative works and accumulated knowledge than all previous human cultures combined, while ensuring that almost none of it would survive in accessible form if the electrical grid failed and the climate-controlled server farms went dark and the satellite networks fell silent. And the expertise needed to maintain and read digital storage systems was lost in the chaos of civilizational collapse. Eleanor contemplated the fact that ancient Sumerian tablets pressed into clay 5,000 years ago remained perfectly readable by anyone who learned the cuneiform script. That Egyptian hieroglyphs carved into stone 4,500 years ago could still be deciphered and understood. That medieval manuscripts, written on parchment 800 years ago, were still physically intact and legible in archives around the world. But that the hard drives and solid-state storage containing our accumulated knowledge would be completely unreadable within perhaps 10 years of losing power and climate control, their magnetic or electronic states degrading beyond recovery, their physical media corroding in humidity and temperature fluctuations, their file formats and operating systems becoming incomprehensible without the specialized hardware and software needed to interpret the ones and zeros that supposedly made digital storage superior to physical documents. She conducted thought experiments about what would survive if modern civilization collapsed tomorrow, and the conclusions were depressing, because most of our buildings were designed to last perhaps 50 to 100 years with regular maintenance. Our roads would crack and crumble within decades as water infiltrated and freeze-thaw cycles shattered the pavement. Our bridges would corrode and collapse within perhaps a century or two as their steel reinforcement rusted and expanded and fractured the concrete. Our vehicles and machinery would oxidize into unrecognizable heaps of rust within a few centuries at most. And almost everything we had created would simply vanish, leaving behind only the most massive concrete foundations, possibly some ceramic materials, and perhaps random fragments of stainless steel or titanium alloys that might survive long enough to thoroughly confuse whatever archaeologists eventually investigated, making them wonder why anyone who could process such advanced materials had apparently built only temporary structures and had failed to preserve knowledge in any durable format. The comparison to ancient monuments was unavoidable and humbling, because the Great Pyramid of Giza had stood for 4,500 years, despite consisting of nothing more sophisticated than limestone blocks stacked with precise engineering, while most of our contemporary buildings wouldn't last a tenth of that time. And the medieval cathedrals of Europe, built of stone, were still functioning after 8 centuries, whereas our steel and glass skyscrapers would likely be collapsing ruins within a few hundred years, suggesting that we had actually regressed in our ability to build permanent structures, even as we advanced in our ability to build tall or complex or aesthetically interesting ones. The preservation paradox that Eleanor identified in her research was that ancient peoples had been far better than we were, creating permanent records, despite having access to much more limited materials and technologies. Because they had understood, intuitively, that if knowledge was important enough to record, then it should be recorded in the most durable format available, which meant using stone, or fired clay, or carefully preserved parchment, rather than whatever medium was most convenient or efficient. And they had built their most important structures with permanence in mind, using massive stones and careful engineering that would endure for millennia, rather than optimizing for construction speed or cost efficiency. We had inverted these priorities completely, recording our accumulated knowledge in the least durable formats imaginable, because they were searchable and compact and easily transmitted, building our structures to last just long enough to be economically viable, rather than designing them to outlast civilizations. And the result was that we were creating more information and more infrastructure than any previous culture, while ensuring that almost none of it would survive to inform whatever peoples came after us about who we had been and what we had learned. Which meant that if catastrophe struck and our civilization fell, the next iteration of humanity might well be starting from nearly zero again, unable to learn from our mistakes or build on our achievements, because we had failed to preserve knowledge in forms that could survive the collapse of technological infrastructure. The question of whether we were actually the 7th civilization in the sequence that the Sumerians had documented, or merely the latest in a longer series that extended far beyond their knowledge, was something Eleanor found herself contemplating with increasing frequency. Because if the pattern of rise and fall was real, and if each iteration tended to preserve only fragmentary memories of the one before, while losing track of earlier cycles completely, then the 6 previous civilizations that the Sumerians knew about might themselves have represented only the most recent cycles visible from their historical perspective, with dozens or hundreds of earlier iterations lost so completely that even the Sumerians, with their careful record-keeping, had no awareness they had ever existed. The geological evidence of anatomically modern humans, extending back at least 200,000 years and possibly 300,000 years, meant that our species had been around for a period of time that could easily accommodate 20 or 30 complete cycles of civilization rising and falling at 10,000-year intervals. And while mainstream archaeology insisted that for most of that period, humans had remained in small hunter-gatherer bands without developing anything resembling civilization, Eleanor had to wonder whether that conclusion was based on actual evidence of primitiveness or simply on absence of evidence for sophistication. Because, as her research had demonstrated repeatedly, civilizations that were destroyed by catastrophe and whose survivors lost technological capabilities could vanish from the archaeological record almost completely within a few thousand years, leaving no trace except, perhaps, a few anomalous artifacts that would be dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications by researchers who assumed that civilization was a recent and singular development. The cyclical nature of human civilization, if the Sumerian records were accurate, and if the patterns they described continued to operate in the present era, suggested that we were not climbing steadily upward toward some ultimate achievement or transcendent state of existence, but rather running in place, building and destroying and rebuilding in an endless loop that accomplished nothing, except generating temporary comfort and convenience for whatever generation happened to be alive during the peak period of each cycle, before the inevitable catastrophe reset everything and forced the survivors to start over from subsistence conditions with only fragments of knowledge preserved from the previous attempt. This was, perhaps, the most depressing implication of Eleanor's research, because it meant that all of human striving, all of our scientific discoveries and technological innovations and cultural achievements were essentially futile exercises that would be erased and forgotten when the next catastrophe struck, leaving no permanent legacy, except the dubious distinction of having briefly achieved sophistication before falling back into primitiveness. And the next civilization would go through the same process of slow development and eventual achievement and ultimate collapse, without learning anything from our example, because we had failed to preserve warnings in sufficiently durable form, or because they would dismiss our warnings the same way we had dismissed warnings from previous cycles as mythology and superstition, rather than actual historical documentation of what happens when civilizations grow arrogant and assume their permanence. Eleanor had expected that her research would eventually provide clear answers about whether the Sumerian accounts of previous civilizations were literally true, or metaphorically meaningful, or completely fictitious. But instead, she found herself inhabiting a space of profound uncertainty, where the evidence was sufficient to suggest that something like cyclical rise and fall had probably occurred multiple times, but insufficient to prove definitively that 6 specific previous civilizations had existed, with the characteristics the Sumerians described. And she realized that this uncertainty was perhaps appropriate, because the real lesson was not whether exactly 6 cycles had preceded ours, but rather that civilization itself was a temporary and fragile state that required constant vigilance and humility to maintain, and that our assumption of permanence was not only unjustified, but dangerous, because it prevented us from taking seriously the threats that could destroy everything we had built. The Sumerians had recorded their knowledge because they wanted whoever came after to understand that the pattern existed, that previous sophisticated societies had fallen, that humanity had been through this cycle before and would probably go through it again, and that the appropriate response was not arrogance about our uniqueness or certainty about our permanence, but rather humility about our position in a much longer story, and seriousness about preparing for threats that operated on timescales beyond individual human lifetimes, but were nonetheless real and inevitable on geological and astronomical timescales. The choice that contemporary civilization faced, according to Eleanor's understanding of the Sumerian warning, was not whether we would face catastrophe, because the geological and astronomical evidence suggested that major disruptions were essentially guaranteed, given sufficient time, but rather whether we would prepare adequately to preserve knowledge and ensure survivors had access to information that could help them rebuild more quickly and perhaps more wisely than previous cycles had managed. And this preparation would require overcoming our bias toward convenience and efficiency in favor of creating durable physical records of essential knowledge, building monitoring systems that could provide warning of cosmic threats or solar storms or volcanic activity with enough lead time to take protective measures. And most fundamentally, shifting our cultural narrative away from the assumption that we are the pinnacle of human achievement and toward recognition that we are merely the current attempt at building something lasting in a universe that regularly tests whether civilizations have learned enough humility and wisdom to survive the testing periods that destroyed everyone before them. The problem was that making these changes would require acknowledging that our civilization might fail, the way previous ones had, and human psychology seemed strongly resistant to accepting that possibility, because it undermined the sense of progress and security that made modern life psychologically tolerable, creating a situation where the very traits that allowed people to function normally in everyday life — optimism, confidence in the future, belief in human agency and capability — worked against the kind of serious preparation and systemic change that might actually improve our chances of surviving whatever catastrophes were coming. The final realization that Eleanor reached after years of research was not a comforting conclusion that would provide closure or resolution, but rather an opening of perspective that made everything more uncertain and more urgent. Because if the Sumerians were right about cyclical civilization, if 6 previous attempts had indeed risen and fallen before theirs, if we were now the 7th iteration, trying to accomplish what none of the previous attempts had managed, then everything about how we thought about human history and human potential and human purpose needed to be reconsidered, because we were not building towards some permanent future state where humanity finally achieved stability and security, but rather participating in a repeating pattern where each cycle had to learn the same lessons and make the same discoveries and ultimately face the same tests. And so far, every single attempt had failed, which meant that our chances of success were not particularly good, unless we could somehow break the pattern by learning from the failures of those who came before us, which required first acknowledging that those failures had occurred, and then taking seriously the warnings they had tried to preserve about the dangers of hubris and the fragility of civilization, and the absolute necessity of humility when confronting forces far larger than human societies can control or even fully comprehend. The closing thought that haunted Eleanor, and that she tried to communicate in the papers and lectures and eventually the book that emerged from her research, was not a prediction of imminent collapse or a claim of certain doom, because she recognized that human resilience and ingenuity had survived previous catastrophes and would probably survive future ones, but rather a warning about false confidence and the danger of assuming we were different from, or superior to, the peoples who came before us. Because that assumption was probably exactly what had doomed each previous civilization. The certainty that this time it would be different. This time we had finally achieved sufficient mastery over nature, and sufficient sophistication in our organization, and sufficient knowledge about how the world worked, that catastrophe could be prevented or survived with our civilization intact, when the actual evidence suggested that no level of sophistication had yet proven sufficient to break the cycle, and that perhaps the only way to break it would be to stop trying to dominate nature and control everything and ensure permanence through technological mastery, and instead to embrace humility about our limitations and fragility about our achievements, and acceptance that everything we build is temporary, and that the appropriate goal is not to create something that lasts forever, but rather to create something worth rebuilding when the inevitable catastrophe strikes, and to preserve the knowledge that would allow survivors to rebuild more quickly and perhaps more wisely than we managed this time. Welcome to Civilization Number 7, Eleanor would conclude in her lectures, and sometimes she would pause there to let the audience absorb the implications before delivering the final line that never failed to produce uncomfortable silence, which was simply this: try not to make it number 6 again. Because the universe seems to have infinite patience for watching humans build and destroy and rebuild in endless cycles. But it's not clear how many more attempts we get before we either learn the lessons that previous civilizations failed to learn, or we damage the planet so severely that it can no longer support the kind of complex civilization that would even be capable of asking these questions. And if we reach that point, then the cycle ends not with catastrophe and renewal, but with permanent reduction to a state where humanity survives, but civilization does not. Where we persist as scattered populations living in the ruins of what we once built, unable to reach the heights we once achieved because we've exhausted the easily accessible resources and degraded the environmental conditions that made those achievements possible. And future generations will look at the mysterious remnants we left behind, the massive concrete foundations and corroded metal fragments, and that distinctive, plastic-filled geological layer. And they will wonder what kind of people we were, and why we were so sophisticated, yet so stupid. So capable, yet so blind. So powerful, yet so utterly unable to prevent our own destruction. And they will probably conclude that we got what we deserved, though Eleanor sincerely hoped they would be wrong about that, because, deserving or not, the loss of accumulated human knowledge and the suffering of billions of people during civilizational collapse was a tragedy regardless of how much our arrogance and short-sightedness might have contributed to making that tragedy inevitable. And perhaps the only redemption available to us now was to at least try to preserve warnings and knowledge in forms durable enough that the next attempt, whether it was the 8th civilization in the sequence or the 80th, might finally learn what we failed to learn, and might finally break the pattern that had trapped humanity in cycles of rise and fall for potentially hundreds of thousands of years. Though Eleanor had to admit that after years of research into how consistently humans ignored warnings from these past, she was not particularly optimistic about whether anyone would listen to warnings from us any better than we had listened to warnings from those who came before.